Hello there, my name is Joshua Clarke. I'm currently a lead practitioner at the Spires College in Devon, and it's my privilege to be here just to talk to you for a few minutes today about the art of essay writing. However, we're not going to try to cover everything involved in essay writing as it is such a broad and technical subject. So instead, we're just going to look at a few things which I've been trying in the last few years, which have taken us a step forward in the work that students have been producing. Um, Now, I do encourage you to have a copy of the slides available as you watch and listen to what I'm saying to you this afternoon as well. I will refer to particular slides at certain moments and just give you the opportunity to pause the video as well if it's useful for you or your department just to reflect and think together on some of the ideas that I'm going to introduce to you. And first of all, I'm going to begin on the third slide, which just gives us a bit of an overview of what we're aiming at. And just underlines a little of the complexity of the task that is essay writing as well, because so many people over time have described the process of essay writing, and I've put a few there for you. And the first one is Alex Quigley, who describes essay writing as being like the creation of a strong rope. Now, this metaphor always sticks with me because a rope is as strong as the individual fibres that interweave with each other, bind to each other to create a really strong single entity. And that is the same for an essay. You know, there are so many individual component parts. There are the ideas linked to the question. There's the contextual understanding that goes around it. There's the sequencing of those ideas. There's the formal academic expression, and many more things as well. And so we are trying to get students to combine all of those elements to form one cohesive and coherent whole. But the second definition there from Judy Simons, how often do we introduce students to essay writing in this way, seeing it as a formidable weapon in the critical armoury? Now, to me, that suggests that an essay needs to pack a punch, that it is a form of writing designed to, yes, explore a topic, and the verb essayer in French means to try, to attempt. That's what the form is doing. But if it is going to also be slightly persuasive, if it's going to form an argument, then it needs to be that weapon as well, that we are trying to bring some energy to the answer that we're writing. Um, if I skip down to the bottom of that slide, it's Peter Womack who suggests that essay writing is not a natural form of writing. And even though it may come slightly more easily to some students than to others, we do need to teach it. And we need to have the confidence that it is something that can be taught as well. It isn't, if you're good at it already, you are good at it. And if you struggle with essay writing, then, we'll write you off, of course. There are many independent individual essay skills that can be taught. And we'll just look at a few that we've been looking at. I've been looking at the last few years. It is worth bearing in mind on the fourth slide there that when we're writing essays under exam conditions, examiners are aware of this, that it is essentially a first draft. It's a first draft that students are writing under duress as well. It's not a comfortable environment. And I've already underlined, I hope, how much they need to do. That said, we can still be aiming for two things in terms of how it's written. Number one is clarity, just good sequencing, good clear speech. It is far better to present ideas in plain English, coherently articulated, than to try to pack it full of the most dense, complex terminology. It is an argument. And an argument clearly expressed is far more powerful, a far more formidable weapon in our critical armoury than something which the reader needs to do a lot of work to comprehend. So that's leading us towards the second word on the fourth slide there, which is readability. We will always talk about the effect on the reader when we are teaching creative composition, when we're teaching narrative writing, description. But how often do we think about that in essay writing? It should also be something readable, something enjoyable to read, something which draws them in, and something which leaves them satisfied at the end too. Worth having to think about that and what you can do in your department to reframe essay writing as actually a strand of creative writing as well. Now, one of the main things that I wanted to touch on today was planning. And this is where I've seen great steps forward. On the screen, on the fifth slide, perhaps you've got some printouts, are four models of essay planning, which suit different kinds. And I'd invite you to have a look at Essays for Excellence by Jones and Webb. I've put a little link to the title of that on one of the latter slides here. And they recommend four different styles of planning. Now, two of these I've used in particular. One of them is the anchor method, this just horizontally aligned one in the top left, but also the grid just below that. The fishbone in the top right and the mind map are quite commonly used. I've used them a bit more for non-fiction writing, sort of in, if you're familiar with paper 2, question 5, if we're thinking about GCSE English language papers. But I'm talking about essays in particular today. So the anchor method first has really transformed how I approach extract based questions. And so I take no credit for this. I want to just keep putting up the name Jones and Webb there from Essays for Excellence, because what a great idea. It is no more complex than a simple timeline, and the timeline represents the chronology of a particular text. The example on that sixth slide now is A Christmas Carol, and the extract comes from the third stave. You might be able to identify that on the slide, right in the middle of the third stave. And it features an episode with roaring fires, warmth inside houses, and Scrooge looking from the outside in, far more cold and dark on the outside. So that's the part that students would have to analyse, but they need to broaden out to show knowledge of the whole text in their essay. So in terms of planning, just positioning the extract on that timeline of the whole text allows them to then think, well, to create something succinct, to create something focused, perhaps I choose something which comes before that, maybe stave one. And I can then talk structurally about how my earlier moment has led into the moment of the extract. And then, if I'm going to aim for a third paragraph, perhaps my second wider text point comes from stave 5, and I can show how the extract prepares the reader to get to that later point. This avoids a real dense mass of all sorts of moments from the text that students might put down if they were planning using a mind map potentially, and just gives them a clarity which then runs through the whole essay. And we know that for top band answers, for something which is perceptive, which is assured, they need to be making judiciously chosen decisions about moments from the wider text. Now, it might be that the extract comes at the end. Fine, but they can visualize that on the timeline and choose a few moments which lead up to it, and vice versa if the extract comes first. Just that visualization of where the extract falls and how they can then build around that has brought great clarity and precision. So I'd invite you to have a think about whether this way of planning might find its place in your own department. Um, Going into the seventh slide, taking a completely different approach with comparison questions. And so for GCSE, of course, it's the poetry anthology, isn't it? Now, there's a nice example from the book, again, Essays for Excellence on the screen. I've slightly adapted this, actually, when I've used it in school. The one of the example has got meanings and ideas, and then a couple of poems put in conjunction there of what the ideas are across two poems, finding the similarities, perhaps finding the differences. And then for AO2, I suppose we're all speaking that same exam language. How have the writers conveyed those ideas? And this really is the crux of that anthology poetry question, isn't it? I said I've adapted it when I've been working with Year 11 this year. We've also put context on the end, and that's just to try to avoid the bolted on element which examiners try to avoid so often. And it just means that they've been discussing context in a bit more of a shaped and purposeful way, treating it comparatively as well, and starting to evaluate the relative impact of the context of one poem as opposed to that of the second. So those two methods of planning are perhaps the biggest takeaway from this session. But before I finish, just a couple of other quick ideas. One which could be taken at A level as well as GCSE, and perhaps even more suited to A level, where students need to dig into the nuance of the questions, can be found on slide 8. And this might be a moment where you pause my video and just share with your department the question I provided. Female figures in literature have to settle for what life offers them. And there's a few texts there, which might be the ones under discussion for some students when answering that question. But you don't need to actually consider any text to try this exercise. If you were really planning a sophisticated and nuanced answer to that question, how would you break it down? What would be the key words in the question that you would engage with and form some sort of debate upon? You could pause the video here now, have a look at that and discuss with your team where it might be. But if you're carrying on with me, you can have a look at slide 9. And I found 4 ways within that relatively short question that you could introduce nuance. So which female figures? Why have you chosen those? Get students to explain why the 2 or 3 or however many they've chosen are the best ones for the question. Then there's a sense of obligation. Do female figures in literature have to settle? Did they have a choice? Was there a sense of obligation? And then the word settle. Perhaps that's not a suitable description of the decisions made by the characters. Is there a sense of their decision being an active preference? You can really hone in on those specifics. Great way of showing a sophisticated view of the question. Um, and then what life offers them. We would need some clarity around what that actually is. Um, I've used huge long banks of sample questions with students and just had them break them down, discuss with me what they would really hone in on in an exam. And that's been a really useful thing. We've seen greatly improved outcomes, certainly in my last year at my previous school, on certain questions where they were taking that approach. And I think moving into the final part of today, just looking at the big ideas and how to introduce them in essays. Now, there's been a lot of work done in recent years around thesis statements. I'm not going to touch on that too much, but as long as we understand the thesis statement is the big idea that a student's essay is going to prove, it should also then be the launch pad, I suppose, of the individual topic sentences which begin the paragraphs, which are doing the analytical work of the essay. Now, on slide 10, I've got an example of doing this with year 13 this year, where I gave them a question that in the text, of Feminine Gospels, the poetry of Caroline Duffy, there is pressure to conform to idealized standards. And how does Feminine Gospels present that pressure of female characters, of women to conform to idealized standards? Now, we came up with a thesis statement which essentially said that societal expectations shaped female identity and their expectations. So then the decision was, what are the 3 subcategories of that will form the different paragraphs? You'll be able to see, if you have a good close look at the 3 related ideas there, that the first way that we decided that expectations shaped identity was by saying that it was damaging to identity. And a paragraph would follow showing the damage. The second related idea was societal expectations dominating a woman's identity. So it's a difference from damaging, dominating. So with that slightly different thrust, we'd have a second paragraph. And finally, the third one, societal expectations contribute to removing female individuality within identity. So all those 3 ideas come within the bracket of shaping identity, but just with that focused planning of what is the particular characteristic, the particular subdivision of the overarching thesis statement. Again, we've ended up with essays which are far more coherent and far more powerful in pursuing a single line of argument. Students don't need to consider everything. They are making an informed decision on what their approach is going to be. And then, of course, we want students to begin those paragraphs in a convincing, compelling way. And just one very small thing, which I've worked on for a few years now with students, and it has led to greater clarity and assurance in what they've written, is positives. Just these little noun phrases, essentially, which expand on some of the nouns in their introductory sentences. So on slide 11, we've got In the Diet, one of the poems from Feminine Gospels. Duffy focuses on the obsession with feminine body image. Okay, well, I've then provided a second one, which you'll be able to see expands on that a little bit, ending up with a third one where there's a couple of positives. So in the Diet, and here it is, one of the collection's fantastical transformation poems. So it's just showing that awareness of where the diet fits in the collection. Duffy, and here's the second, the continual defender of women's individuality. So I'm honing in there on what we'd expect of her poetry based on the typicality of her work. Better than just bolting on some context. This is integrated. It's starting to form the thrust of my argument. You can work on the positives like that with students in all sorts of ways. Pick out the nouns, get them to develop positives based on them. How many can you put into a sentence in the early days, and then work on the judicious nature of the decisions that they make. But a nice little way to enhance the readability and I guess thoroughness of their responses. So I'll leave it there. There is some recommended reading on the 12th slide, and then just a few questions to consider on the final one. And I'd love to hear your ideas based on those. Perhaps what your students find difficult with essay writing at the moment, what you've already tried, and whether any of the very brief strategies I shared with you today um, you deem to be useful. All right, thanks very much for listening, and bye for now.